So our third writer is a contemporary philosopher, Susan Wolf. Still alive, still very much alive. I've got a video where I interview her. And she wants to make a distinction between the big question that seems to be the question that Tolstoy and Camus and others are engaged with, which is whether or not there is a meaning to life writ large, to human existence, and the meaning of particular individual lives. Now, what she's going to argue, a sort of core point that she makes, is that we are very committed and very committed to and familiar with a distinction between lives that are meaningless, we know people who have meaningless lives, and lives that are meaningful. And that there is clearly value in this distinction, and she wants to explain what is the difference between the lives that we view as meaningless and the lives that we view as meaningful. So it is possible to make a distinction. Not all human life is in the same boat. Camus and Tolstoy seem to have this view, Camus in particular, that all human existence is necessarily absurd. It's a feature of human life. But that isn't really the way we operate. We say, we have attitudes towards some people who we think are wasting their lives, and we have admiration for others who we say, well, we should be more like them. So clearly we are operating with a kind of distinction. And she says, okay, given that we make that distinction, what is it based on? I'm going to do classic philosophical analysis and try and get at that distinction. I'm going to give an analogy to what she's doing here with what, I'm not sure how helpful this is, but in the debate about free will versus determinism. Okay, maybe I've already lost a lot of you, but bear with me. Determinism, the idea that every event is necessarily caused by events that preceded according to unbreakable laws of nature, seems to be a threat to human freedom, because if it's true, it seems like everything we do I couldn't have done otherwise, and I am compelled to do that by the laws of nature just as much as I am compelled to fall if I jump out of a window by the law of gravity. Everything I do is, as a result, a predictable result of the laws of nature. Now, the pessimists about freedom say determinism means that no human life is free. Then there is a group of people called the compatibilists. A classic example of making this kind of argument that I'm making right now is by a guy called Peter Strawson in a famous article called Freedom and Resentment. I've got a video on that if you want to watch it. He says, look, it's not an all or nothing thing. Whether or not determinism is true, we're still totally familiar with the distinction that some things that people are responsible for, and that therefore we should resent them if we don't like it, and some things are accidental, and we don't resent people. If the wind blows me and I bump into someone, you shouldn't resent, the person I bump into shouldn't resent me. But if I am just, I don't think much of them and I barge into them because I don't care about them, then you should resent me. And there's clearly an important distinction there that is irrespective of whether determinism is true. She's doing the same thing, irrespective of whether or not there is meaning to human life. And she says that issue has pretty much been settled, and she says basically if there's a God, then there's a possibility for meaning, and if there isn't, then, you know, basically someone like Camus is right. And as she says in a footnote, maybe even if there is a God, there isn't meaning. And Nagel, for example, makes this point, and Nozick is another guy who makes this point. And I'm just going to make the point for them. The idea that God gives meaning to a life is in the same way that the purpose of an artificial object is given it by its creator. So the reason why toasters have the purpose to toast bread is because they were made for that purpose by their creators, in this case humans. So presumably, if we are made by God, he created us for a reason, and so his reason is our purpose. But that's not necessarily the purpose we want. Think of, for example, Judas. Judas is one of the most important figures in all of Christianity, because if you buy the story of Christianity, Jesus had to be sacrificed to save humankind, and in order for Jesus to be sacrificed, Jesus had to be betrayed. There had to be someone to betray him. It's Judas. Jesus knew it would be Judas. He said, "One of you will betray me," sort of looking meaningfully at Judas. So Judas is an incredibly important. He is perhaps one of the most important humans who have ever lived, according to Christianity. So he for sure has a purpose. Is it a purpose that he would want? Does he think, oh, great, my life has meaning? Well, to give you some clue, according to Dante, there are two people in the lowest circle of hell, and one of them is Judas, the worst part of hell. So, not much of a reward there for a meaningful life. So even if our life, if God gives our lives meaning, it might not be meanings that we would embrace. Okay, so she moves on pretty quickly from the big question of the meaning of life, and she says, I want to talk about the meaning of individual lives. And to do this, to illustrate that there is something to examine, I'm going to give examples of meaningless lives first. And she gives three different examples. The first one is an individual she calls the blob. A person who spends day after day or night after night in front of a television set, drinking beer and watching situation comedies. This is old-fashioned. It would be someone sitting in the basement playing World of Warcraft now, because no younger generation watches TV anymore. They just play video games. This, she says, is obviously a meaningless life. Now, you might say, if she's lost you already, then her argument is not going to have much force. It's very important to her argument that merely you enjoying your life is not good enough for it to be a meaningful life. And, we think an obvious example of this is, imagine if someone who was perpetually anxious and they said, okay, I'm going to fix this by becoming lobotomized. I'm going to be lobotomized and I'm going to have a wire put into the pleasure center of my brain that stimulates it. They can do this with rats already, and the rats learn how to press the switch so that electrical current goes through the pleasure center of their brain, and they will just stay there until they starve because they're so happy. Well, imagine if someone opted for that life. They would be happy for the rest of their existence, but we wouldn't call that a meaningful life. I don't think anybody would say that is a meaningful life. So we do view some lives as meaningless. Another example, the blob is passive, but that doesn't mean that all meaningless lives are passive. You can have active meaningless lives where the activity is useless. And she gives two examples. One of the idle rich who flits about, fighting off boredom, moving from one amusement to another. She shops, she travels, she eats at expensive restaurants, she works out with her personal trainer. Later on, Woolf makes sure to say this person is not necessarily bad. Imagine that they also give enough to charities to offset their carbon footprint and more. So you can't say that we disapprove them just because they're immoral. Let's say this person isn't more immoral, and in fact has a more positive impact on the world than you or I because of their wealth, but we still say that their life is meaningless. Another one is a corporate executive who works 12-hour, 7-day weeks, suffering great stress for the sole purpose of the accumulation of personal wealth, ignores his family and so on. Finally, there's somebody who fails to achieve what they intend to do. A man may devote his life to creating and building up a company to hand over to his children, but the item his company manufactures is rendered obsolete by technology shortly before his planned retirement. His whole life has been a failure. We would say there is some sense in which his life is meaningless. I think a lot of people get very uncomfortable at this judgment. Who are we to say lives are meaningless? But Woolf evidently has no problem with it. Maybe she's a judgmental person. But I think it's certainly true that we have these intuitions. Okay, so that's the meaningless lives. If we're going to say there is such a thing as meaning in life, then there has to be meaningful lives. And we have to, and if we can come up with a few examples of that, then maybe we can get at the contrast, and that will tell us what it is that these have and these lack. And she gives some examples that include Albert Schweitzer, and actually she says Tolstoy. And because, as I said in the video on Tolstoy's My Confession, remember after he had this crisis, he changed his life and devoted it to helping the poor and giving away his money. He seems pretty saintly, and we would say that his life is definitely meaningful. Okay, her analysis is that what these things lack is a clue to what meaningful lives have. So in summary, a meaningful life is one where you are actively and successfully, so there's activity so that you're not like the blob, you're successful so you're not like the failure, engaged in projects of positive value. Now she says projects, that makes it sound like there has to be one thing that you complete. But she says, I mean projects very open-endedly. So organizing a union or a high school band, those can be included, but also having a relationship or having a family. You don't necessarily think of that as a project in the same way. I'm building this family like I build a house. So it's understood very broadly. She says projects encompass not only goal-directed tasks, but other sorts of ongoing activities and involvements. Okay, what do you mean by engaged? Well, one of the examples of someone who had a meaningless life was the alienated housewife. She gave the example. Alienation is this idea that you are somehow separated from, if you're alienated from your life, this is very much the way that the absurd manifests itself for Camus, that you are not part of it, you're not engaged with it. For example, Marx famously said that in capitalism, the worker is alienated from his labor. It is separated from him and monetized for the good of the rich. He is not in control. He doesn't control his activities. It's as if they're not part of him. They're not something he identifies with. So to be engaged in the project, you have to happily embrace them. The project must engage the person whose life it is. Ideally, she should proudly and happily embrace them as constituting at least part of what your life is about. So in other words, if you're stuck in a dead-end job that you hate, obviously that isn't true. Finally, what is positive value? And she says, well, I want to leave it as open as possible. I want to have different views of what is a good life. I'm not going to adjudicate between them. For example, I'm not going to rule out sport. I'm not going to say sport is a pointless activity. But I am going to say one thing, and she says positive value cannot be purely subjective, because clearly one of our key intuitions is that there is a distinction between lives that actually are meaningful and lives that simply appear meaningful. And in fact, she says you can have an epiphany. You can be going along believing your life to be meaningful, therefore it having subjective meaning, and suddenly realize, oh shit, I was wrong this whole time. It wasn't meaningful. You can have a kind of an epiphany of the kind that Camus says is when you experience weariness. That's when you suddenly step back from your life and say, oh shit, there was no point to any of that. She says, it may be precisely because one did not realize the emptiness of one's project or the shallowness of one's values until that moment that the experience I'm imagining has the poignancy it does. If positive value was allowed to include subjective, then that would never happen, because you finding it meaningful would be enough and there would be no discovery that it wasn't in fact meaningful. So the positive value has to be objective. Now, this is an important point for her. She says there is such a thing as objective standards. And as she says later on in the paper, some things just are better than others. And when she says just are, she says whether or not there is a God. She says human beings are better than mosquitoes. There's just a hierarchy of value in the universe. Does it matter that we weren't created by God? No. Even if we are the random products of evolution, human beings still are just objectively better than mosquitoes. That's just an intuition. And she says, I don't have to defend it because you believe it too. So when she says some things, to have positive value, they must be objectively good, not just subjective. She says, when I say objective good, that's not necessarily moral. We should be careful, however, not to equate objective goodness with moral goodness, at least not if we understand moral value as essentially involving benefiting or honoring humanity. The concern for meaning in one's life does not seem to be the same as the concern for moral worth. Nor do our judgments about what sort of lives are meaningful seem to track judgments of moral character. She says, to be sure, some of the paradigms of meaningful lives are lives of great moral value, including Tolstoy, but Gauguin, she gives an example, a famous artist who was, I think, an accountant or something like that, and then deserted his family, ran away to Tahiti, and apparently abused the subjects of his painting, which tended to be indigenous people from Tahiti, but he produced paintings that are regarded as masterpieces. And he discovered this late in life. Gauguin just said, screw it, I hate this life, I want to be an artist. So he abandoned his life and left his wife and family totally behind and went off to have sex and paint in Tahiti. She says, that's a meaningful life. He was a bit of a shit, though, that's for sure. He certainly didn't lead a moral life. Wittgenstein is another one. Wittgenstein is regarded as a great philosopher, but pretty much a horrible person. He worked as a teacher of children at one point and beat them. He was just not necessarily a nice person. So in other words, you can have a life of positive value without it being moral value. Okay, so what is the value of this? We say, why should people have a meaningful life? She says, well, it's not for the good it does the world, because we've already made the distinction between a good life and a moral life. So, for example, since a meaningful life is not necessarily a morally better life than a meaningless one, the Olympic athlete, she said, is an example of someone whose life is meaningful but doesn't necessarily do much good for the world. It is not necessarily better for the lives, and they're not necessarily particularly happy one. Many of the things that give meanings to our lives, relationships to loved ones, aspirations to achieve, make us vulnerable to pain, disappointment, and stress. From the inside, the blob's lazy passivity may be preferable to the experience of the tortured artist. So the value of meaning is not for the good it does to the world, a meaningful life does to the world, not for the happiness it gives the person whose life is meaningful. She says, we want, but it is true, we do think that a meaningful life is valuable, and not only do we think it's valuable, we want in ourselves to want this, and we are judgmental of people who do not want this. She gives an example of, she dislikes corporate individuals. So she gives an example of the overly enthusiastic corporate lawyer, who presumably falls into this category. And she says, we want for that person to wake up. Now, it would be bad for this person to have the epiphany and realize, oh my God, this thing that I've thrown my life into, there's no point to it. It's meaningless. I should abandon it. In some sense, it would be bad if she has that epiphany, but it would be worse if she doesn't, and if just goes on living a happy life of a corporate lawyer, because her life is meaningless. So it's like the Matrix, you know. Should you take whichever pill it is, I assume it's the red pill, that makes you realize, that makes you unhappy, but reveals true reality to you. Yes, we think you should. You should take that pill. And so it is important that you recognize what a meaningful life is so that you can achieve it, but not for either of these reasons. So what is the reason? What is the value of a meaningful life? And her answer is kind of strange. Her answer is that in leading a meaningful life, or in wanting a meaningful life, you are avoiding a mistake. You are avoiding a mistake. The mistake is thinking that you are the center of the universe. So, and so the truth that you recognize that leads you to a meaningful life is that you are insignificant, that you are, from the big picture, tiny. You are a speck in the grand scheme of things. You're not such great shakes, essentially. Now, what's interesting about this is that she's suggesting this realization is essential on the path to a meaningful life. But this sounds like just the kind of recognition that leads to the view that your life is absurd. This is the stepping back that Thomas Nagel talks about in his essay on the absurd, where you look down on your life and see you as like an ant striving, and it's kind of ridiculous and laughable. And yet she's saying, no, you need to make this recognition because that's part of what it's essential to achieving meaning in life. So as she says, well, why doesn't this recognition lead to what she calls pessimism of the kind that Camus and Tolstoy achieve? Well, why is it a mistake? Why is the recognition of why is being solipsistic, which means regarding oneself as the center of the universe and as being inherent, I'm more important, the kind of thing that narcissists do. Why is that a mistake? She says, the answer, I believe, is that to devote one's life entirely to activities whose value is merely subjective, to devote oneself to activities whose sole justification is that it's good for you, the person, is in a sense, I shall try to explain, practically solipsistic. That is, in practice, it's putting yourself in the center of things. It flies in the face of one's status, if you will, as a tiny speck in a vast universe. A universe with countless perspectives of equal status to your own. So, she draws on again on the work of Thomas Nagel, who argues that there's a great quote. It's a joke, as pretty much everything he says is, by Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks says this: tragedy is when I cut my finger. Comedy is when you fall into an open sewer and die. Okay, that's a joke. He doesn't really think that, but that is illustrating the point of view of someone who has not made this recognition, the solipsist. They think their pain is valuable and your pain has no worth. You've got to avoid that mistake. Why have you got to avoid that mistake? Because it's a mistake. You shouldn't make mistakes. It is a mistake. Now, avoiding that mistake is not going to necessarily make your life go more easily. It's not the kind of mistake, as she says, like a mistake in geography or math. A mistake in geography or math can make obvious mistakes. You can get lost, or you can lose lots of money, and it will undercut your general well-being. It will be bad. It will make you worse off. This kind of mistake, thinking of yourself as more valuable than others, that won't have the same kind of effect on you. But it's still a mistake. It is a mistake of practical reason. She says you've got to avoid this. And what does she say to the pessimists? The pessimists are right about the futility of trying to make ourselves important as far as contemplation of the cosmos makes us aware of our smallness. whether as individuals or as a species. We simply must accept it and come to terms with it. Some people do undoubtedly get very upset, even despondent, when they start to think about their cosmic insignificance. They want to be important, to have an impact on the world, to make a mark that will last forever. When they realize that they cannot achieve this, they are very disappointed. The only advice one can give to such people is, get over it. Okay, helpful. That's not what you really expect from a philosopher. But she says, rather than fight the fact of our insignificance, that is, there is no meaning of life, big L, my proposal is that we live in a way that acknowledges the fact, or at any rate harmonizes with it. So, how do you live a life that harmonizes the fact that we are a speck? By recognizing that what that means is that we're just as valuable as other people or as other things in the world. There is what it doesn't mean. Here is the mistake that the pessimists, including Tolstoy, she says, make. If God doesn't exist, so if there is no meaning to life, then nothing matters. She says that's wrong. So her big disagreement with the pessimist is she believes there is objective value in the world, even if God doesn't exist. And she says it's just a fact. Look at it. This is what we believe. You believe it. I believe it. It's just a fact. There is objective. Some things just are better than others. So she says this is ridiculous, this idea that if God doesn't exist, then nothing matters. Things still matter. Things other than you matter. And a meaningful life is one that acknowledges that things other than you matter. That's what the core is. That's why you've got to be engaged in projects of positive value. This part, you being engaged, is what gives you the subjective oomph that you want, but this is what makes them of genuine value. So her big disagreement then is that that there is positive value in a godless universe. And a meaningful life is one that acknowledges this and acknowledges that you are not the center of all things, that subjectivity is not the best you can do. You can still have objective value in a universe without God. Now, of course, Camus is going to just deny that and say that this is a mistake, and that the only thing left is to rage against the meaninglessness of it. But that is what Woolf arrives at, and she arrives as I say, she's saying, look, let's not start from the high theory and say, okay, God doesn't exist. Well, God must be the source of all meaning, and therefore there is no meaning. So every time we think about meaning, we're mistaken. She says, no, let's look carefully. Let's look at our intuitions about meaning and value. Let's take them seriously, and let's see what must be the theory that underlies them that makes sense of these intuitions that are a core part of human existence. And this is what she comes up with.